Star Wars 7x7 episode 2300. How about that? So yesterday we made a brief mention about the transition from the ostentation of the High Republic to the austere Clone Wars era Jedi, and what that could mean for how things develop over time in the galaxy far, far away, and what our real world situation might be able to tell us about it. Well, today's the day. Punch it. Hey Rebel Rouser, I'm Alan Voivod and this is Star Wars 7x7, your daily dose of Star Wars joy, and thank you so much for joining me for it. So here's what I continued to think about when I continued to think about the notion of going from that, very ostentatious to that very austere type of Jedi from the High Republic until a couple hundred years later to the Clone Wars era Jedi, and how that might be reflected in our real world. Well, this is a gross oversimplification of world history that's about to follow. And I'll start with a maxim that had made the rounds for a while, the notion that when religion was the primary influence in people's lives, then churches were the biggest buildings around. And then when government became the biggest influence in people's lives, then government buildings were the biggest buildings around. And then when corporations became the biggest influence in people's lives, then those were the biggest buildings around. And that's how it progressed, from churches to government buildings to corporate skyscrapers. That's how it's kind of traveled over time. But that oversimplifies even more than I was going to. If you basically draw a line at the Enlightenment, right? You go back hundreds of years and you look at the influence of religion on people's lives. Like, that's sort of the all-consuming thing, but also tightly entwined with the state. And by the state, I mean a monarch, because that's what we're really talking about here. Monarchy and religion were very closely tied together until you get to Martin Luther and Protestant Reformations and, British monarchy splitting off from the Catholic Church to create the Church of England and all this fun stuff. And then you start seeing democracies pop up, like what happened in the United States. And that's sort of where things change, not just, with the US, but just that's part of the, overall over time situation where major players on the world stage were moving away from monarchies and heading toward democracies or other forms of representational government, where suddenly religion is not taking as big a role in people's lives. That's not to say that it was being utterly, backburnered or relegated or put away, but things like separation of church and state were becoming, commonly thought of, and government was taking more of a role in people's daily lives, having more of an influence on people's daily lives. And as a result, religion as a primary driving force for events on the world stage tends to take a back seat to government being a driving force of what's happening on the world stage. And that's what I'm wondering about when we talk about the High Republic and its transition eventually over the course of a couple hundred years to the Clone Wars era Jedi. How does that reflect what we have seen in our world? And, when you also consider the fact that, what's happening in the High Republic era is that the Outer Rim is comparatively undiscovered, unexplored, and that the Jedi are starting to, be part of the outreach to the Outer Rim, it does kind of bear an echo to the, religious colonialism that we've seen in our world, although I think I'm safe in presuming that the Jedi are not going to be slaughtering people the way that it happened in our world. So, they're going to be good, I'm sure of it. But I think it's also going to get complicated in some ways as well. And whatever this conflict is that's going to happen with the whole High Republic storyline, maybe this is going to end up being, as they say in the press materials, a threat to the Force itself. Does that mean that it's a threat to the Jedi Order and their station and influence in the galaxy? It seems like that is a possibility, especially then, when we look at the Clone Wars era and the Jedi are there, but they are subservient to the Galactic Republic, to the government. And we don't get the idea that that's the case in the High Republic era. Instead, it seems like government is the primary force of agency in the galaxy by the time we get to the Clone Wars era stuff. And yes, it's, corrupt, and yes, it's ineffectual, and that's part of the, life cycle of governments, especially something as enormous as the Galactic Republic. And yet, they did get to that point where it seems like the government influence is much stronger, comparatively speaking, than the Jedi influence. And there's one other wrinkle that I want to throw in as a contributing factor potentially as well, which I will do in just a second. This is just my daily ask. If you are listening on iTunes and you haven't yet rated or reviewed the podcast yet, I hope today is the day you're going to do it. If you're not listening on iTunes and you think to yourself, wow, it might be worth it to just go leave a rating or review, that would be awesome. That would be really fun, and I'd greatly appreciate that. If you've already done it, I really appreciate that as well. Thank you. But if you haven't yet and you're listening on iTunes because it'll be easiest for you, then please consider leaving a rating or review on Star Wars 7x7 today. It really does help people find Star Wars 7x7 more readily when they're looking for a daily dose of Star Wars joy. And thank you so much for considering it. So here's that other thing. Part of the development with separation of church and state was also tied to religious liberty, religious freedom, religious tolerance of other people's religions, not persecuting people for their choice of religion. Well, that, to try to draw it into the Star Wars realm, you'd have to consider the possibility that there are different churches, and there are, and particularly with Force-centered religions. So one recent example is Rogue One, where we discover a whole bunch of different Force-centered religions that are operating or have people worshiping and operating on Jedha. For example, there's the Nin Orthodoxy, there's the Zealots of Susan, there's the Disciples of the Wills, and the Guardians of the Wills. They're actually two different groups. There's the Firmists, that's Phirmists, and then there's also the Church of the Force, which is the church to which Lorsan Tekka belongs, not to mention the Jedi Order itself. So with this notion of all these other Force-centered religions cropping up, it does make one wonder if there's an eventual move toward religious freedom, religious tolerance, at least as far as Force-based religions go, and if that's something that could lead potentially to deciding that there has to be a separation between the Jedi or the Force-based religions and the government, i.e. the Galactic Republic, and whether that will play any role in the development of the High Republic Storytelling Initiative, or if that's going to be something that happens outside that, but still somewhere in between the place where we go from the High Republic to the Clone Wars. So there you go. That's my deep-ish dive, as much as we can do in a short podcast like this, to consider how religion and government have interacted in our times and how that might give us an idea about what happens between the High Republic and the Clone Wars in the galaxy far, far away. And that is going to do it for this episode of the show. Thank you so much for joining me for it, as always, and may the Force be with you, wherever in the world you may be.
Star Wars 7x7 is not endorsed or sponsored yet by Lucasfilm Limited, Disney, or 20th Century Fox, and is intended for entertainment and information purposes only. Star Wars, the Star Wars logo, all names and pictures of Star Wars characters, vehicles, and any other Star Wars-related items are registered trademarks and/or copyrights of Lucasfilm Limited or their respective trademark and copyright holders. May the Force be with them. All original content is copyright 2020 by Star Wars 7x7. We hope you love it.